The noon train screeched to a halt in the desert heat, its iron wheels spitting sparks across the baked red rails of Ironwood Station, Arizona Territory, 1879. Passengers poured onto the platform, their laughter and leather boots echoing beneath the blazing sun, but one woman stood alone. Susannah Mae Whitlock, bonnet askew, clutched a single faded carpet bag and a wilted bouquet of prairie asters. She'd traveled 1,500 miles by rail and stage to meet a rancher who had sworn, in perfumed letters, to cherish her as his bride. Yet as the other couples embraced, a station porter glanced at the passenger ledger, shook his head, and muttered the word that split the air like a rifle crack. Deserted. Snickers rippled through the crowd. A banker's wife whispered, "Left on the shelf before she's even wed." A pair of drovers spat tobacco and grinned. Susannah's cheeks burned hotter than the desert itself, but she refused to cry. What she didn't see, what no one cared to notice, was the tall, solitary figure leaning against a weather-worn telegraph pole at the platform's edge. Taza, a widowed Apache scout exiled from his people and mistrusted by the whites he guides, watched the scene unfold with eyes the color of desert midnight. The ache of Susannah's rejection mirrored the silence in his own chest, a silence that had lingered since his young wife's grave was covered by drifting sand 3 winters ago. 2 outcasts, worlds apart, bound by the same invisible chain of loneliness. As a dust storm gathered on the horizon, and the train's whistle wailed its mournful farewell, Susannah swayed, her dreams crumbling like dried river clay, until Taza stepped forward. Their fates met in that single heartbeat, beneath the unforgiving Arizona sun. What happens next will break your heart, and forge a love stronger than iron and fire. The wind howled like a wounded beast across the open plain, flinging dust into every corner of the raw, sun-scorched town of Dry Creek. The town clung to life like a burr on a mule's tail, barely there, stubborn and half forgotten by the world. Wooden buildings leaned wearily into the wind, their paint stripped long ago by sandstorms and summer sun. Saloons, a feed store, and a half-collapsed church made up the spine of the main road. Stray dogs and tired men wandered through town with the same hollow-eyed look. At the edge of this brittle outpost, nestled against the crooked arm of a rocky bluff, was a clapboard shack with a sagging roof and a small chicken pen that hadn't seen a hen in months. It was here that Susannah Mae Whitlock lived, if you could call it living. She woke each day before the sun bled over the horizon and tied her boots tight to keep the cracked soles from falling apart. Her fingers were calloused from scrubbing, laundry for the boarding house. Her back ached from hauling water up from the well. Once back in Missouri, Susannah had known the rustle of silk skirts and the scent of rosewater. That life had vanished like dew on desert stone when her father died, and creditors took everything but the clothes she wore. She'd followed a whisper of work west, only to land in Dry Creek, a town that needed labor but gave no kindness in return. "She talks too proper for a girl with dirt under her nails," Mrs. Nettie Plum, the preacher's wife, once said as Susannah passed. The other women laughed behind her back, clutching their baskets and clutching tighter to their husbands. To them, Susannah was a mystery wrapped in failure, a girl with no people, no place, and no ring on her finger. Even the boarding house matron, Mrs. Tompkins, kept a suspicious eye. "Don't be bringing no trouble to my doorstep, Miss Whitlock. Men don't need tempting, and girls like you, well, you know how talk spreads." Susannah nodded silently and worked harder. The days blended together, hot and hard. She ate cold biscuits alone and mended torn shirts by candlelight. Her dreams, once filled with music and lace, had narrowed to surviving the week. Yet, in her loneliest moments, she still kept a worn bundle of old letters in a wooden box beneath her cot. Letters from other towns, other women, mail-order brides sharing their stories of strangers who became husbands, of prairie weddings and slow-blooming love. It was foolish, but sometimes she traced the loops of those letters with her finger and imagined one being written for her. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday. The wind had calmed for once and the sun had just begun to dip when the town's wiry telegraph boy, Jesse, ran down the boardwalk waving a letter in his hand. "Miss Whitlock," he called, his voice cracking with youth. You got a letter. Susannah blinked, hand still buried in a basin of lye-soaked laundry. No one wrote her. Not ever. Jessie skidded to a stop and handed her the envelope, eyes wide with curiosity. It's from Colorado, he whispered, as if that made it more important. She took the letter with trembling fingers. The paper was rough, the ink slightly smudged, but the handwriting was careful. Dear Miss Whitlock, my name is Luther Barron, a rancher out of Grady's Crossing near Silver Rock Pass. I heard from a preacher's wife up in Abilene that you're an honest woman seeking a fresh start. I ain't got much charm, but I got land and a steady fire in the hearth. If you'd consider being my wife, I'll send for you, fair and square. Let me know by post. I'd be proud to have you beside me. Sincerely, L. Baron Susannah stared at the words until they blurred. A man. A home. A chance. She tucked the letter into her apron and excused herself from her shift. That night, by the flickering flame of a stub candle, she wrote back, Dear Mr. Barron, I would be honored to become your wife. I have no dowry, but I offer honesty and hard work. I pray we find peace together. Yours respectfully, Susannah Mae Whitlock. A week later, a second letter arrived with train fare enclosed and the date she was to arrive in Ironwood Station. Mrs. Tompkins scoffed and muttered something about men being blind, but Susannah didn't care. She washed her best dress 3 times and sewed a new ribbon into her bonnet. The town's gossip swelled like a summer creek. She's no better than she ought to be, hissed one woman. Probably trapped him with lies, said another. Susannah held her head high, because for the first time in years, she had something no one could take from her. Hope. When the day came, she stepped aboard the westbound train with nothing but a carpet bag, her mother's locket, and a heart cracked wide, open for something new. She didn't know yet that the promise waiting on the other end was as empty as the sky. Nor did she know that someone else, someone not bound by the laws of white men or the whispers of small-town women, was watching. Someone whose soul carried its own sorrow and who would in time offer her not pity, but something far rarer. Something like love. Ironwood Station, Arizona Territory. April, 1879. The iron beast let out a final hissing breath as it came to rest along the rust-colored tracks. The desert sun beat down on the platform with merciless force, drawing sweat even from stone. Passengers spilled from the train in a rush of dust and chatter, but Susannah Mae Whitlock stepped down slowly, carpetbag in hand, bonnet tied tight beneath her chin. Her boots hit the wood planks with purpose, even if her heart fluttered in, her chest like a bird trapped in a box. She scanned the platform, searching for a tall man with a worn hat and honest eyes, someone who might match the tender letters signed L. Barron, but what she found was nothing. Strangers bustled past. A child dropped a rag doll and was scolded. A freight driver cursed at a mule, but no one looked her way with recognition. She waited and waited. 1 hour passed, then another. The sun crept higher, and her hands trembled around the wilting bouquet she'd brought with her. Behind her, at the far end of the platform where shadow met light, Taza leaned against a weathered telegraph pole, arms crossed, watching. His skin was sun-bronzed, his dark hair braided back beneath a faded red headband. He was broad-shouldered, silent and still, like the desert itself. Most folks avoided looking him in the eye, out of fear or ignorance. But Taza saw everything. He saw how the girl's face fell a little more with each passing minute. He saw the way the townspeople began whispering. She got left, said a man near the depot, laughing into his drink. Mail order mess, added a woman, her parasol twitching. Shame. Too pretty to be tossed aside like that. Susannah tried to ignore them. She kept her chin high, even as her lips quivered. Just as she began to step toward the ticket office, perhaps to ask for the impossible, to send a wire to a man who clearly wasn't coming, she heard the crunch of boots behind. Her. Your man didn't show, a low voice said. She turned. There he was, tall, powerful, with storm cloud eyes and a weathered face carved by years of sun and sorrow. But he was not Luther Barron. His coat was patched, his hands rough, and he carried no air of apology. "I beg your pardon?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "You waited 2 hours. He's not comin'." Taza's tone held no malice, just fact. "You'll need to find shelter before sundown. Coyotes don't care for broken hearts." The remark stung more than it should. "I don't need your pity," she said sharply. "And I'm not broken." He raised a brow. "Didn't say you were." A long silence stretched between them. Wind tugged at her skirt. Around them, eyes lingered. Townsfolk pretending not to stare, while drinking in every awkward moment. "You're Apache," she said suddenly, not as an accusation but with curiosity. Taza didn't flinch. "And you're stranded. We both got names." "Susannah Mae Whitlock," she replied after a pause. "From Dry Creek. Or at least, I was." "Taza." More. Silence. Finally, he shrugged and turned to leave. "There's an old bunkhouse 2 miles west. Belonged to a rancher who passed last fall. Empty now. If you want to stay there a while, I'll show you the way." Her pride bristled. "Why would you help me?" He didn't turn back. "Because no one else will." The words lodged in her throat. She looked at the station, the smirking townspeople, the empty tracks. Her train was gone. Her future had vanished with it. "Fine," she said. "Just for a few days, until I decide what to do next." He nodded once, not offering a smile, not expecting one. "Bring your things. The sun drops quick out here." They walked side by side into the setting gold of the desert, not speaking. He didn't offer his hand, and she didn't ask for it. But in that heavy silence, something stirred. A tension neither of them could name. Misjudgment had marked their first meeting, but it would not be their last. Behind them on the platform, Mrs. Agatha Brooks leaned close to the station clerk. "She's running off with an Indian now? Lord have mercy. That girl's trouble." The clerk snorted. "Maybe so. Or maybe she just found the only man out here with any honor left." And far out on the trail, beneath the first stars of twilight, Susannah walked behind Taza. 2 strangers bound by chance, by pain, and by a trail that neither had meant to walk together. Not yet. Old Sand Hollow Bunkhouse, outside Ironwood Station. April 1879. The bunkhouse stood like a weathered memory beneath the shelter of the Red Canyon cliffs, its walls faded gray, its roof patched with sheet metal and hope. Inside, it smelled of old smoke, dry timber, and lonesome winters. The front door groaned on its hinges every time the wind breathed too hard, but it kept the world out, and that was all Susannah needed. The first night, she slept on a straw-filled mattress behind a tacked-up curtain, listening to the quiet crackle of Taza's fire in the hearth. He didn't say much, never did, but he kept his distance, sleeping on a pile of blankets near the door like a watchdog who didn't trust the dark. By day they worked in silence. Taza hauled water and split wood while Susannah swept out decades of dust, patched the torn curtains, and cooked whatever she could make from beans, cornmeal, and wild onions. He never asked her to stay, and she never asked him why he'd offered help in the first place. Still, she noticed things. He moved with a quiet grace, each motion efficient and grounded like someone who'd lived long with the land. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was low and even, like thunder far off in the hills. His eyes, dark and unreadable, seemed always to be watching her, but never with hunger, more like curiosity or warning. Susannah, in turn, kept her chin up and her heart behind stone walls. She had known too many men who spoke sweet and turned cruel. This one was different, silent, unreadable, but still a man, and she had no space left inside her for foolish hope. Taza respected her space, but that didn't stop the tension from building. One morning, as she was hanging wet linens on the sagging clothesline, her fingers brushed against his as he handed her a wooden clothespin. She stiffened. He froze. Their eyes met just for a second, long enough for something unsaid to pass between them, then vanish just as quickly. At supper, she caught herself glancing at his hands, broad, scarred, strong, and wondered what they might feel like wrapped around hers in something other than labor. She shook the thought away like dust off a hem, but the quiet moments kept coming, like the time he returned from a hunting trip, carrying a pair of rabbits slung over his shoulder, and silently handed one to her. She didn't ask where he found them. He didn't ask what she'd cook. But the way his gaze lingered on her lips, as she blew the steam off the stew, it made her hands tremble slightly as she ladled it into bowls. Still, they said nothing. The silence was safer. Then came the visitors. A week after Susannah's arrival, a rider approached from the west, long-legged and loud-mouthed. Clayton Riggs, son of a rancher, full of smirk and swagger, the kind of man who treated women like poker chips. He'd seen Susannah once before in town, and now that she was out here without protection, he came sniffing. Well, well, he drawled, tipping his hat low as he dismounted near the bunkhouse. Heard tell a pretty little bride got herself. Stood up. Thought I might offer some, companionship. Susannah stepped out onto the porch, her arms crossed. I'm not in need of company, Mr. Riggs. Clayton grinned, eyes running over her dress like he owned the stitches. You livin' with him? He jerked his chin toward the trees where Taza had just stepped into view, bow slung over his shoulder. She didn't flinch. We have an arrangement. That what they call it now? He snorted, then turned to Taza with a sneer. Don't. See many of your kind playin' house with white girls. Figure you're taking what ain't yours? Taza didn't blink. He stepped closer, quiet as a shadow. Get off the land, he said. Clayton looked like he might spit, but something in Taza's eyes made him think twice. I'll be back, he muttered. Won't always be around to scare folks off. As he mounted up and rode off, Susannah stood stiff on the porch, her face pale. You didn't have to say anything, she murmured. Taza stared after the dust trail. Yes, I did. That night, the silence returned, heavier than ever. Susannah washed dishes with rough strokes, the anger in her shoulders plain. He sat near the fire, sharpening a blade, but his mind was elsewhere. It wasn't until 2 days later, when the air turned cold and wind swept down from the mountain, that something changed. Taza hadn't returned from his day's trek. She waited until dusk, then lit a lantern and stepped outside, heart pounding. She found him slumped near the ridge trail, blood soaking the leg of his trousers. A cougar had crossed his path, its paw print still visible in the dust nearby. He'd fought it off with a blade and a stone, but not without cost. Taza, she cried, rushing to him. I'm fine, he grunted, trying to rise. You are not, she snapped. Don't be stubborn. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she tore her petticoat for a bandage. Their eyes locked. For once there was no pride in either of them, only breath, pain, and something warm flickering in the shadow of night. Later, after she cleaned and wrapped the wound, she sat beside him on the floor of the bunkhouse, watching the firelight flicker against the beams. You saved me from that man, she whispered. He didn't look at her. You didn't need saving, just someone to stand beside you. She turned her face to the fire, the ache in her throat rising. I'm not used to that, she said, voice breaking. Men. They usually leave. For a long moment he said nothing. Then softly, I don't leave. And for the first time, Susannah believed it, even if her heart was still too bruised to understand why. Old Sand Hollow, bunkhouse, late April, 1879. The desert was unusually still that morning. The wind held its breath. The birds kept to the mesquite, and even the sun rose more slowly, burning orange and low like a warning fire on the horizon. Taza stood at the creek bed sharpening a flint blade, the rhythm of stone against edge steady as his heartbeat. Inside the bunkhouse, Susannah stirred cornbread batter with a light hum, her hair loosely tied back, sleeves rolled. The quiet between them had softened over the past week, not gone, but no longer barbed. She had even begun to sleep more easily, her mind no longer haunted by the echo of that station platform or the man who never came. Then the rider appeared. A cloud of dust rose in the distance, cutting across the dry basin like a scar. Taza saw it first, his shoulders tensing as he slipped the knife into his belt. When the figure became clearer, dark coat, pale hat, riding like he owned the earth, Taza's jaw tightened. The rider pulled up before the bunkhouse and dismounted with practiced ease. Luther Barron. Susannah stepped onto the porch and froze. Her bowl slipped from her hands and shattered against the floorboards. Flour dust curled in the air like smoke. "Tarnation," she whispered. Luther looked her over like a man inspecting a piece of livestock he once bought and forgot to collect. "Susannah Mae," he said, voice smooth as oil. "I came back for you." She blinked, stunned. "You... what?" "I got held up in Tucson," he said, removing his hat. "Business deal went sideways. Meant to send a telegram, but I figured I'd come in person. You're still mine, ain't you?" Before she could answer, Taza stepped forward from the shadow of the shed. "She's not yours." Luther turned, eyeing him with narrowed contempt. "Didn't figure you'd shack up with a savage," Susannah gasped. "Don't," she warned. But Luther pressed on, cold smirk curling his lip. "I see what happened. You thought I left you, so you ran off with the first warm body who offered a roof." "I didn't run anywhere," she snapped. "You left me. You humiliated me in front of a whole town. I had business," he repeated. "I'm here now, so pack up. We'll ride out by sunset." Taza didn't move, but the tension in his shoulders radiated like a drawn bowstring. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't choose to." Luther stepped closer to her, ignoring Taza now. "Be honest, Susannah. You think this is real? What you got here with him?" He spat the word like it was dirt in his mouth. "You think any of these people will ever see you as more than a girl who got abandoned and warmed in Apache's bed?" That did it. Taza took one step forward, hand curling into a fist, but Susannah was quicker. She raised her hand and struck Luther square across the cheek. "You don't get to come back and act like nothing happened," he reeled, touching his cheek. "You made a mistake," he growled. "No, you did." Luther backed away, mounting his horse without another word. His eyes met Taza's one last time, burning with warning. "This ain't over," he muttered before riding off. Silence fell hard after. The dust settled. Susannah stood on the porch, arms wrapped tight around herself, face pale and shaken. Taza remained where he was, his body rigid, jaw clenched. She turned to him, expecting, hoping for words, but instead, he stepped back. "You still love him?" he asked quietly. Her eyes widened. "What? No, Taza, I didn't know he was coming. I didn't ask him to. But you didn't send him away." "I did. You struck him, but you didn't shut the door." The words hit like gravel. She blinked at him, wounded. "You think I want to go back to him? After what he did?" "I don't know what you want," he said, his voice hollow. She stepped forward, reaching for him, but he turned away. "You said you don't leave," she whispered. "I don't," he said. "But I don't beg either." Taza walked inside the bunkhouse, picked up his bow and saddlebag, and slung them over his shoulder. "You're not the only one with a past," he said without turning. "Some of us had to bury ours to survive, and..." With that he walked out the door, the wind slamming it shut behind him. Susannah stood there alone, arms trembling, heart pounding. She didn't know whether to chase after him or scream into the desert sky. She had thought they were building something, slowly, carefully, but now it felt like it had all turned to dust in a matter of minutes. And out in the hills, beneath the first gathering clouds of an oncoming storm, Taza rode without looking back, his past once again catching up to him, and his heart too raw to admit how much that girl had already taken hold of it. Near Sand Hollow, Arizona Territory. 1 week later, dusk, a bruise-colored wall of clouds marched over the far mesas, swallowing the sun in rolling thunder. Dry heat turned electric. Every breath tasted of copper. Susannah Mae Whitlock stood alone outside the bunkhouse, eyes on the sky, feeling the air tighten like a rope. She braced the shutter with a nail, then hurried to gather the few possessions she would never abandon. Her mother's locket, Taza's flint knife, left behind on the table, and the half-finished quilt she had stitched during his silence. Somewhere, in the jagged hills to the north, Taza rode hard, following a deer path back toward the canyon mouth. He'd spent 6 restless nights apart, pretending he could let the hurt scab over. But distance only deepened the ache. When the first thunderhead cracked and a lightning spear struck the ridge behind him, he smelled smoke on the wind, a sweet, terrifying scent that pulled him south, straight toward the bunkhouse he swore he wouldn't see again. Susannah was hauling the water barrel closer to the door when the lightning bolt found the brittle cottonwood next to the chicken pen. The tree exploded in a spray of sparks, burning limbs cartwheeled across the yard, setting tumbleweed alight. Flames leapt from bush to bush, chasing the wind toward the house. She dropped the barrel, splashing mud across her boots, and ran for the pump, only to find the handle broken halfway down its stroke. The world narrowed to fire and heat, and the stunned pound of her own heart. From the trail, another rider emerged through the flickering haze. Luther Barron, hat low, coat flapping like a crow's wing. Whether he had come to claim her or taunt her again, she never learned. For the moment, he swung down his horse, reared at the firestorm, and fled, leaving him cursing. Luther staggered toward the porch, smoke swirling. "House'll go up like tinder," he shouted. "Come with me, Susannah, now." "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, eyes stinging, voice raw with smoke and old wounds. He grabbed her arm. She shoved him back. "Let go." Before Luther could answer, hoofbeats thundered in from the arroyo. Taza burst through the orange glare astride a sweat-lathered Mustang. He slid from the saddle, eyes finding Susannah first, then the burning cottonwood, then Luther. The greeting was a silent clash of flint and steel. "No time," Taza snapped, already shrugging off his bedroll. He dunked the canvas in the half-spilled barrel and threw it over Susannah's shoulders. "Stay low. Cover your mouth." Flames licked the porch post. The roof's tar patches began to bubble. A gust tore sparks across the doorway. A curtain inside bloomed into fire. Susannah darted toward the threshold, instinct screaming to rescue what little she owned. Taza caught her wrist. "Not worth dying for," he growled. "My mother's locket." He shoved the wet canvas bundle into her hands. "Hold this." Then he vanished through the smoke-filled door. Luther coughed, eyes wide. "He'll roast in there." "Then help him," Susannah said through the cloth at her face. Luther hesitated, the first sign of fear she had ever seen in him, before stumbling after Taza. Inside, heat battered Taza like a furnace bellows. Rafters popped, a flaming beam crashed, pinning Luther's coat to the floorboards. Taza hauled him free, pushed him toward the opening, then dropped to one knee beside the little crate beneath Susannah's cot. Black smoke swirled around his head. Sparks hissed on his buckskin vest. He seized the locket and a folded scrap of calico, her half-finished quilt, and ran. They erupted onto the yard just as the roof caved, vomiting sparks into the darkening sky. Taza thrust the locket into Susannah's sooty hands without a word. Together they dragged Luther away from the radiant heat until his knees buckled and he collapsed on the bare earth, breathing hard. Wind shifted. The wildfire charged east toward the dry creek bed, leaving the three of them sprawled in a shallow swale. Overhead, the thunderhead finally cracked open, releasing sheets of rain so sudden and cold they steamed on the scorched ground. For a long, while only the hiss of rain and Luther's ragged breathing filled the night. Susannah turned to Taza. His hair hung wet across his brow. Ash streaked his cheek, and blood seeped where a glowing ember had kissed his forearm. But in his eyes burned the fierce light she'd missed since the morning he left. "You came back," she said, barely louder than the rain. "I smelled smoke," he answered, as if it were explanation enough. Yet his voice trembled at the edges, a sound she had never heard from him. She pressed her palm to his injured arm. He didn't flinch. "I thought you were gone for good," she whispered. "Everyone leaves." "Not everyone," he said. Raindrops carved clean tracks through the soot on his face. "I ran because I was afraid. Afraid of Luther. Afraid of losing more than I already have." His gaze dropped to where their hands met. "You saw how I am. Half in your world, half without a place. I thought staying would break us both." Susannah's breath caught. It breaks me more when you're gone. Thunder rolled again, softer, like distant drums. Luther stirred behind them but stayed down, too ashamed or exhausted to rise. The storm's hard edge faded to a gentle patter. Taza brought her locket forward, thumb brushing the tarnished silver. I went back for this because I knew it mattered. I don't know how to give you fancy words, Susannah Mae. Just truth. She lifted her eyes to him, tears turning ash to muddy rivulets on her cheeks. The truth is all I've ever needed. The space between them felt fragile as blown glass. He leaned, not quite closing it, breath mixing with hers beneath the rain's faint hum. Somewhere a coyote called, long and lonesome. I should have told you sooner, he murmured. Raindrops gathered on his lashes. The words lodged in his throat like arrowheads. In that pause, everything unsaid pulsed between their hearts. Susannah reached to smooth damp hair from his brow. Her fingertips lingered, trembling with relief, with fear, with a love neither could yet speak aloud. She swallowed the confession rising to her lips, afraid naming it might shatter the fragile moment they'd fought fire to reach. Behind them, flames hissed and guttered beneath the rain until only smoke curled skyward. Ahead, the bunkhouse lay in charred ruin. Yesterday's life turned to blackened bone. Tomorrow waited, empty as a fresh-washed sky, and they would have to fill it together or walk separate ways. For now, they simply knelt in the muddy swale, faces inches apart, hearts hammering, storm-soaked and silent. The rain eased to mist. A single star pierced the clouds overhead, silver and shy. Taza exhaled. Susannah mirrored him. Neither moved, neither spoke, and in that tender, unfinished hush, the fire-lit night folded itself into a promise neither had voiced, but both finally felt. Sand Hollow, Arizona Territory. 2 weeks later, the bunkhouse stood half rebuilt, ribs of pine still bare against the spring sun. Life had returned to the ranch, but something quieter, colder had slipped between Susannah and Taza, like frost between new roots. He worked from dawn until after dusk, never quite meeting her gaze, and she, unsure of what their fire-forged moment meant, didn't press. It was as if the storm had burned away the tender words they hadn't said. Then came the letter. Sheriff Dunley brought it while Susannah was hanging the laundry on the sagging line. He tipped his hat with a sheepish smile, and she wiped her hands on her apron before accepting the envelope. "Looks official," he said. "Came in on the mail wagon out of Prescott." She unfolded it carefully. The words struck her heart like the lightning that once split the cottonwood. "Miss Susannah Mae Whitlock." Luther grabbed her wrist. "This is madness. The Reverend won't marry you to that." Reverend Pritchard cleared his throat, eyes flicking between the pair and his nervous parishioners. "The good book says those whom God hath joined are of one heart," Susannah finished, voice rising. She turned to the crowd, tears shining. "Taza is the only man who ever heard my heart. If that damns me in your eyes, so be it. I will not trade love for respectability." Silence deepened. Even Mrs. Brooks shut her mouth. Sheriff Dunley stepped forward at last. "Baron, you've made your offer. She's refused. Time to ride." His hand rested not on his sidearm now, but on Luther's shoulder, iron firm. Luther glared at Taza, at Susannah, at the townsfolk whose courage dissolved under his stare. But he saw no ally, only closed doors. With a vicious hiss, he crumpled the license and strode out, boots echoing like gunshots in the hush. The instant the doors slammed, Susannah sank to her knees beside Taza. He caught her, folding her against his chest. She wept openly now. Years of humiliation and longing released in shuddering waves. "I thought you'd given up," she cried. "I thought I didn't matter enough." He wrapped the quilt scrap around her fingers. "You are my heartbeat. I was a fool to ride away." Around them, townspeople shifted. Some ashamed, some curious, a few quietly smiling. Sheriff Dunley removed his hat in respect. Reverend Pritchard set down his Bible and knelt too, one hand over theirs. "Love," the Reverend said softly, "has a way of teaching us all." and while lanterns flickered and the fiddle lay silent, Susannah raised her face, cheeks wet, eyes blazing with a joy fierce as desert sunrise. Taza brushed her tears with his thumb. They did not notice when the sheriff ushered hesitant townsfolk outside, nor when Mrs. Brooks closed the hall doors to grant them peace. For that sacred moment, the world was only two hearts, two quiet breaths, and one truth finally spoken aloud. Sand Hollow, a week later. Summer dust settling over the canyon floor. The wagon creaked slowly down the road leading to the edge of Sand Hollow, the wheels grinding through ochre clay and brittle roots. Taza held the reins with one hand, the other resting protectively over Susannah's gloved fingers as she sat beside him beneath the stitched canvas cover. Her bonnet brim fluttered in the breeze, but her smile remained steady, filled with something deeper than peace. Belonging. Ahead, the sunlit rise of their modest ranch came into view. The burned barn had been cleared, the house patched with fresh planks. The front gate stood open and a group of townsfolk, some on foot, others mounted, waited in the dusty yard. As the wagon drew closer, murmurs rippled through the small crowd. Agatha Brooks, lips pursed like dried apples, glanced down at the pie in her hands and reluctantly stepped forward. "Figured you might need something sweet after such a long week," she muttered, shoving it into Susannah's hands without meeting her eyes. Susannah blinked, stunned, but managed a polite nod. "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Brooks turned briskly and walked off without another word. Behind her, Clayton Riggs gave Taza a curt nod. "She fixed the roof better than any man I ever hired. If you need extra hands for spring planting, you let me know." Taza gave a single nod in return. No grand speeches, no fanfare. But here, among the dust and sweat of the frontier, those small gestures meant the world. Children from town ran up laughing, tossing dried petals and giggling as they scattered. "You gonna have a wedding?" one boy shouted. "Is it gonna be Apache style?" another piped in. Taza only smiled faintly as Susannah's cheeks flushed. "We'll do it our way," she said softly, glancing up at her husband-to-be. The crowd slowly began to thin, returning to chores, to lives that didn't stop just because two hearts had finally found one another. Yet there was no longer hostility in their steps, just quiet curiosity and cautious warmth, and that was enough. Later that evening, on the ranch, the sun melted behind the ridge, leaving the sky drenched in violet and rose. Crickets chirped, and the smell of horses, fresh soil, and something frying in cast iron filled the air. Taza knelt by the front porch with a small bundle of seeds, fingers sifting through soil softened by Susannah's care. "Beans?" she asked, crouching beside him. He looked at her hands, clean, calloused, strong, and nodded. "They'll do better this year," she grinned. "Because they know they're wanted now." Together they planted the first row. No words were needed, just the rhythmic press of fingers into dirt, the hush of leaves swaying, the silence of two people no longer running. A hawk circled above, casting a long shadow over the field. When the row was done, Taza stood and brushed off his palms, watching her rise beside him. Her bonnet had fallen back, golden strands caught the last light of dusk. He reached out and tucked one behind her ear. "You never asked me why I waited at that station after you left," she said, voice soft. He met her gaze, silent. "I waited 2 days," she whispered. "Just in case you came back. I thought maybe I was worth a second look." He stepped closer, cupping her cheek. "You were always worth more than I believed I could offer." They stood still, her hands gripping his shirt front, his forehead resting against hers. A breath passed, then another, and then laughter. Quiet, real. It bubbled up between them like the relief of rain after drought. "I burned the biscuits," she confessed with a groan. Taza didn't flinch. "We'll plant more corn. You'll figure it out. Or we'll starve with a pretty garden." He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then finally, softly, her lips. 2 days later, the churchyard. The bell rang at noon. Not for a funeral, not for a warning, but for joy. Susannah walked barefoot across the chapel grass, her white dress simple, tied with ribbon, her hair unpinned and braided with wildflowers. Taza stood beneath the old cottonwood tree behind the chapel, not before a crowd, but before a few close souls. Reverend Pritchard, Sheriff Dunley, young Jesse holding the rings in trembling hands. There was no grand music, just birdsong. No altar, just the sky. The Reverend kept it brief. Sometimes love is found in letters, he said. Other times in fire, blood, and silence. What matters is that it survives. Taza took Susannah's hands, weathered fingers, wrapped in softer ones. I walked the long way to find you, she said. He pressed her fingers to his lips. And I nearly lost you by running. I'm here now, she whispered. And I won't let go. The rings were slipped on. Silver. Bands hammered by the town's blacksmith. When the Reverend said the words, Taza kissed her. The kind of kiss that said home is not a place but a person. That night, beneath the stars, on the porch of their ranch, they sat close, a quilt over their legs. A warm wind stirred the wheat, grass. Above them, the stars burned like old prayers finally answered. Susannah leaned against his shoulder. You still think the world has room for us? He didn't speak for a long time, just watched a shooting star streak across the sky, fading into the quiet of the hills. Then finally he murmured, the world might not, but right here, this ranch, this porch, this sky, it's ours now. She smiled, eyes glistening with the truth she'd waited a lifetime to hear. And as he took her hand, calloused palm to calloused palm, the final words of the night drifted, like promise, into the dark. This time she wasn't going anywhere. In a world that once cast them both aside, her for being too alone, him for feeling too much, they found something neither expected: home in each other. Susannah, once labeled deserted by strangers who never knew her heart, became the heartbeat of a land she was never meant to survive. Taza, the silent shadow of a fading people, found peace not in solitude, but in her laughter, in her stubbornness, in the quiet faith she gave so freely. They didn't heal all at once. There were still storms, still whispers in town, still nights, when the past knocked on their doors. But side by side they answered every trial with something stronger than pain. Love chosen, love earned. Because sometimes, the most beautiful stories begin where others leave, not with perfection, but with two broken souls choosing to stay. And in the dust, under stars older than memory, a ranch once empty now echoed with new life, soft footsteps, and the kind of silence that finally felt like peace. Because home isn't a place you find, it's the heart that refuses to leave. And this time, she wasn't going anywhere.